Our second scripture this morning is Nehemiah chapter 1, verses 1 through chapter 2, verses 5. I promise it's all good. While I was in Susa, in the capital, one of my brothers, Hanani, came with certain men from Judah, and I asked them about the Jews that had survived, those who had escaped the captivity, and about Jerusalem. And they replied, "The survivors there in the province who escaped captivity are in great trouble and shame. The wall of Jerusalem is broken down. Its gates have been destroyed by fire." And when I heard these words, I sat down and I wept. I mourned for days, fasting and praying before the God of all heaven. I said, "O Lord, God of heaven, the great and awesome God who keeps covenants and steadfast love with those who love him and keep his commandments, let your ear be attentive and your eyes open to hear the prayer of your servant that I now pray before you day and night for your servant, the people of Israel, confessing the sins of the people of Israel, which we have sinned against you. Both I and my family have sinned. We have offended you deeply, failing to keep the commandments, the statutes, and the ordinances that you commanded by your servant Moses. Remember the word that you commanded your servant Moses. If you are unfaithful, I will scatter you amongst the people. But if you return to me and keep my commandments and do them, though you are outcasts at the place which I have chosen, I will establish your name. They are your servants, and they are your people, whom you have redeemed by your great power and your strong hand. O Lord, be attentive to the prayer of your servant and to the prayers of your servants who delight in your name. Give success to your servant today and grant him mercy in the sight of this man." See, at this time, I was the cupbearer to the king, and when wine was served to King Artaxerxes, I carried that wine in and I gave it to the king. Now, I had never been sad in his presence before, so the king said to me, "Why is your face sad? Since you are not sick, this can only be a sadness of the heart." And I was afraid. I said to the king, "May your king live forever. But why should not my heart be sad when the city, the place of my ancestors' graves, lies in waste, and its gates have been destroyed by fire?" And the king said to me, "What do you request?" So I prayed again to the God of heaven, and I said to him, "If it pleases the king, and if your servant has found favor with you, I ask that you send me to Judah, to the city of my ancestors' graves, so that I may rebuild it." And the king said to me, "How long will you be gone? And when will you return?" This is the word of the Lord. Thanks be to God. During World War II, after France was conquered by the Nazi regime and the Vichy government was set up, in collaboration with Nazis, the government sought to flush out and deport any French Jews they could. They were largely successful, as 90,000 French Jews were eventually deported and sent to concentration camps to die. But not every French person or city collaborated. The city of Chambon did not. Led by their pastor, André Chocmet, over those years they hid 4,000 Jews from the Nazi authorities, mostly children. They were the descendants of French Huguenots who had been persecuted by Catholics in the 17th century and sought asylum away from them in the mountains. They knew what it meant to be afraid for their lives. They were not driven by secular reasons, though, or even their own history. What drove them to risk themselves day after day, year after year, for strange Jews and their children was Scripture. The day after the Vichy government signed an armistice with Germany, André preached this. The duty of Christians is to resist the violence brought on their consciences. We will resist whenever our adversaries demand obedience contrary to the orders of the gospel. We will do so without fear, without pride, and without hate. This small mountain town of Huguenots saw the pain and evil in the world, and they did not shrink from it. They acted against it. And they are one of the only cities in the world recognized by Israel as a city of refuge. In our scripture this morning, we have a story of a man of God who hears and sees the pain and suffering in the world and does not shrink from it, instead committing himself to saving strangers once again. Nehemiah is powerful. He is separate from the pain of his people, but he risks everything for the chance to help them. And he does not do it because he will gain anything from it. If anything, he will lose everything by offering to do it. Instead, he does so because of who he knows God to be and what he knows God commands. And like Nehemiah, this remains a true commandment to us that our faith in God is not just an abstraction, but it leads us. And it always leads us to act on behalf of those who suffer in the world. But like Nehemiah, we've got to listen to the right people before we know who needs help. Recently on Forbes Online, the journalist Paul Glader wrote a column because a lot of his friends had been asking the same question to him over and over. How do I know what's true in what I'm reading in the media? He had a lot to say, a lot of recommendations of papers that he really respected that lean both conservative and a little more liberal. But one of the things he really encouraged his readers to do was to check their ethics standards for their sources of news. He said, if a reporter gets facts in a story wrong, will that news outlet investigate a claim and then publish a correction? Does the publication even have its own published source of ethics? Does it subscribe to and endorse the Society of Professional Journalists Code of Ethics? And if a reporter on staff violates those ethical codes, will they be fired? Interestingly enough, though, he pushes beyond just knowing if who you're reading has an ethical code at all. He said you don't need to look at just big national papers like Washington Post or Wall Street Journal. He really encouraged his readers to look close to home, saying in the post-truth age, citizens need to support local and regional publications, because donating to these papers gives them the ability to cover officials to see if they're actually doing what they said, to protect our taxes and see if they're being used for the reasons they said they were. Because it's the people on the ground who know the city best that can provide you with the wisdom to know what to do. Wall Street Journal and Washington Post might report on Houston, but it'll be from 20,000 feet. Houston Chronicle will report from, what is it, where are we, 5 feet below sea level? This may seem like a new concern. How can I trust what I'm reading? But Nehemiah probably struggles with how to know what to believe when it comes to the city of Jerusalem. He has been the cupbearer to Artaxerxes for years. We have no idea if Nehemiah was born in Jerusalem and then was deported, or if he was born in Susa and raised in the diaspora. But we do know that kings and leaders of countries have a tendency to prefer official news sources, because official news sources can be more effective propaganda than people who investigate you. And Nehemiah may have known from official news sources that Judah and Jerusalem have been conquered, but that doesn't mean he understood the reality of what's happening on the ground. It takes a local news source, his brother Hananiah and the men with him, to report on what's actually happening in Jerusalem. The survivors there in the province who escaped captivity are in great trouble. The wall has broken down. The gates have been destroyed by fire. And judging by Nehemiah's weeping response, this is news to him. Apparently, he has not been receiving a true report about the state of his people from the king Artaxerxes or any other official in Susa, and perhaps that is not surprising. You don't want to tell the scattered exiled people in your city that their family at home is burning. It might have been really easy for Nehemiah to reject this local source because he couldn't verify it himself. It might have been easier to accept the official party line from Artaxerxes. But he doesn't. He believes. He weeps. And then he prays. We need to be hearers of news like Nehemiah. Like Paul Glader's friends, we are really a lot more lately trying to parse out the difference between facts and an opinion, between clickbait and a well-researched article. But in the search to be better informed, we still have this tendency to try to shut out the pain of the world because it doesn't fit our established preconceptions about what it should be. In our search to combat climate change, we can't ignore that there are coal miners and their families suffering from losing their jobs. In a commitment to a well-ordered society, we cannot ignore the lived experiences of African American communities that are traumatized by police brutality. As our military serves the government's purposes abroad, we cannot ignore that the death toll of Iraqi civilians since 2003 is over 170,000 dead. But we turn off the channels that tell us the stories we do not want to hear, don't we? Too often we are shutting off the news because it challenges what we think, because it challenges what we know. But when we shut it off, we are shutting off the cry of God's suffering people. And that's not what we need to do. We have to have eyes that are open to see. We need ears that are open to hear. We need hearts that are open to be broken. Hearing is only the first step. Because like Nehemiah, we have to pray so we know how to help. The period between my ex-husband's incarceration and when I filed for divorce was over 2 years. And that seems like a really incredibly long period of time to everybody I tell that story to. But I needed time. I needed time to make a decision, and not because I'm not a person who makes decisions easy. I can make decisions pretty fast. See, during that time, I was in weekly therapy. And my therapist was cautioning me against making really hasty decisions in the wake of an incredible trauma. And she was right, of course. I was experiencing, though I didn't know it, typical symptoms of PTSD and trauma-related suffering. I was struggling with emotional dysregulation, where whatever I was feeling was much bigger than the scenario called for, like crying in a Target parking lot because I remembered this episode of Deep Space Nine. It's a really sad episode, but it's not Target crying in the parking lot sad. I struggled with what's called numbing, where your emotions get detached from your thoughts and behaviors and memories. And that was a really hard concept for me to understand until my therapist brought up the fact that ships in Star Trek have shields that keep things up. My therapist and I were both Star Trek people, if that. I needed to say that out loud. I also had what are called somatic responses. I couldn't sleep for a long time, but that was probably connected to the fact that my 19-month-old also wouldn't sleep. But in all of that tumult, in the somatic responses and the traumatic responses, there was a really good chance that if I tried to make a really big decision like filing for divorce, I was going to make a bad decision. So I didn't. I spent those years healing and seeking a perspective outside of myself. And because I'm Christian, that meant I spent 2 years praying. I spent 2 years trying to distinguish between my own emotional reactions and what God's will was going to be for my life. This text makes it clear that Nehemiah is traumatized and grief-stricken about what happens in Jerusalem. Not only does he weep for days, but he fasts for days. But I think it is telling that the first thing he does after receiving traumatic news about people he loves is that he prays. O Lord, let your ear be attentive to the prayer of your servant, to the prayer of your servant who delights in revering your name. Nehemiah steeps himself in conversation with God, reminding himself that the wisdom of his faith and the story of his people is a solid perspective on which he can make his next steps. Remember, Nehemiah is an incredibly powerful man in Susa. When I say cupbearer, that doesn't really sound very important to our culture, but the cupbearer is one of the closest counselors to the emperor that there is. He has access to the ear of Artaxerxes. The Artaxerxes who's in the 300. Anybody see 300? With the cool gold jewelry? That's Xerxes. With this access comes responsibility, and with this access comes danger. To move from trauma to action with no pause to gather God's wisdom, Nehemiah might have suggested something that put his own people in more danger rather than less. He might have put his own life in danger if he acted too hastily. But Nehemiah rejects haste and instead embraces the calm in the presence of God. I think we could learn something from that. We have this instinct to rush when we learn about suffering, to alleviate suffering, and that's a good and it's a godly impulse. When there's a flood in Louisiana, we all want to drive there and help out those people, but you know what happens if we all drive to Louisiana? It's not good for the people of Louisiana because none of us know what we're doing. I don't know how to rebuild a house. Am I coming with food? Did I remember to get gas? It's always better to send money first to the people who are already there than it is to show up on your own. But it comes from this impulse. We know that God shows up when his people are suffering, and we want to do that too. But if we rush too quickly into the breach, we cause more problems for those in the breach. If we fail to pause and to seek God's will and perspective, we fail to let God actually be Lord of all of our life. To pause in the midst of trauma, whatever that trauma is to allow God space and time to teach us what we need to learn to form us into the people who can respond out of abundance rather than tornness. Nadia Bowles-Weber says it's preaching and acting out of your scars rather than your open wounds. To pause in prayer also gives God a chance to convict us of the ways in which we have participated in the suffering of others. Now, this pause is not forever, I promise, even though sometimes in my experience it takes 2 years. But the pause should be long enough that you can hear what God is speaking. Because after that, after God starts talking, well, it's time to start doing. Because like Nehemiah says, if we hear people calling for help, we have to step up. Jeremy and Jessica Courtney were Americans like everybody else who were shaken after the terrorist attacks on 9/11. As a couple, they started asking questions of themselves, like, what kind of people do we want to be in the aftermath of this? What is moving us right now? And their church community was also asking hard questions. What does it really look like to love your enemies after something like this? Now, in aftermath of 9/11, there was a huge rise in hate crimes against Muslim Americans. They were being discriminated against because of what they looked like and their clothing, and often they were vilified as enemies, though they had done nothing wrong. And as Jessica and Jeremy learned more and more about what ripped the Middle East apart, about poverty and globalization and the consequences of American imperialism, they moved to Turkey. But even that move wasn't the final one, because Istanbul eventually became the launching pad for them to move to Iraq. Because as the war started in 2003, they saw Iraq fall into chaos. They moved there out of a desire to dare to see if they could make a difference in loving those people who had been called their enemies. They now run something called the Preemptive Love Coalition. If you want to look that up, you can Google it. What began as connecting doctors to people who needed heart surgery has become, in the wake of ISIS, an organization that administers emergency relief to Iraqi refugee families. Sometimes the response that God calls you to do is to get up and travel. After this shock of bad news and this time in prayer, Nehemiah, he goes whole hog. He goes to the only person who has the resources to help him do what he feels God is calling him to do, and it's the king of Persia. I said to the king, the place of my ancestors' graves, they lie in waste, the gates have been destroyed by fire, and if it pleases you, if I have found favor with you, send me there. Send me there that I may rebuild it. This is an incredibly audacious, maybe stupid step for him to take. Why would Nehemiah, even though he is a trusted counselor and high official in the court, ask King Artaxerxes to help rebuild a city he helped conquer? Nehemiah is risking everything in this moment. Risking everything for a city he has not seen and for people he does not know, and Artaxerxes could reject this request outright, cast Nehemiah out, and Jerusalem would never know the difference for Nehemiah's mistake. But Nehemiah knows that God desires more for the people of Jerusalem, and so he risks. And there's more chapters after chapter 2 because it works. Nehemiah goes to Jerusalem, and through enough mistakes and hardships to rival the plagues of Egypt, he rebuilds what has fallen. As Christians, we've got to be known by more than just the people who say our thoughts and prayers are with you in this difficult time. Because guess what? That does not cut it anymore. We've got to be more than just the people who pray. We've got to be well-informed. We've got to be prayerful. We've got to know what suffering is happening in the world, but we've got to be actors. Like James said when Jen read it earlier, we must be doers of the word and not just hearers, or we're like people who look at ourselves in the mirror and instantly forget what we look like. With Jesus, it's action required. Hungry people get fed, thirsty people get water, people who need clothes get clothes, sick people get visited in hospitals, refugees get welcomed, and sometimes you even get called to leave behind your whole life and move to Iraq and have children while ISIS bombs your neighbors. Now, you may not be called to Iraq, but you may be called to the shifting communities of homeless LGBTQ youth who make up a large population of the homeless population in Houston. who are often kicked out of their families for religious reasons and then become sex workers so they can survive on the streets. Those may be your people. You may be called to the fear-stricken families of undocumented immigrants who live amongst us now, afraid to pick up their children at school or to drive or to go to work because they might be picked up on a surprise raid by ICE. I don't know where you're called. But no matter what the risk is, when you hear the cry of people in need and you've done the work to pray to God to know those are your people, your grief has got to move you. Your grief has got to move you, or it's just selfish. Nehemiah hears bad news. Nehemiah prays about bad news. Nehemiah acts on bad news. So the next time your heart breaks, or whatever you're watching on the news or reading on your phone or seeing on Facebook, consider being like Nehemiah in your response. Be wise to know if what you're reading is true. Have ears to hear those who are crying out, even if it challenges what you thought was true, and have a heart ready to be broken, so that when God speaks, you are ready to act. That's what the life of faith is. It leads us to act on God's behalf for the people who need it most. So, are you ready?